The winter wind crept through Ash Hollow like a weary spirit, sighing through pine branches and rattling the shutters of the old inn. Snow blanketed everything, roofs, fences, the rutted trail that led toward the river, until the world looked scrubbed clean and silent. Inside the kitchen, where the hearth fought the cold with a weary flame, Martha May Collier stirred a pot of venison stew. Her hands were red from heat and work, her apron dusted with flour and ash. Steam rose and brushed her cheeks, but even warmth could not melt the tightness in her chest. She heard laughter drift in from the saloon across the frozen street. Hattie Dunn's sharp, mocking voice carried easily through the still air. "Ain't no man wants a fat girl," she crowed, and the men around her chuckled the way men do when cruelty tastes like camaraderie. May stiffened, her stirring slowing. She told herself she was used to it, yet each word pressed deeper, like grit beneath skin that never quite healed. She was not the sort of woman folks noticed kindly. Too round in the face, too broad through the hips, too quiet when the world prized charm and brightness. She spoke softly, because soft words couldn't be used against her. She smiled politely, because indifference hurt less than pity, and when nights grew cold, she stayed near the kitchen stove, pretending that the fire's hiss was conversation. That night, as snow thickened, the door to the inn opened and a man stepped in, tall, shoulders dusted white, his coat stiff with frost. In his arms he carried a small bundle wrapped in wool. The air seemed to fold inward at his entrance, as if silence itself were listening. May recognized him at once. Sheriff Elias Boone. His wife had died that autumn, leaving behind a newborn girl. Folks said he'd buried her himself on the hill beyond the churchyard, beneath a spruce tree. "Evenin', Sheriff," she said, brushing her hands on her apron. Her voice trembled despite her calm. He nodded once, weary eyes lifting to meet hers. "Evenin'. Just need something warm for the little one." The baby stirred, small sounds muffled by layers of cloth. May reached for a mug, poured milk from the pan she kept by the stove. "She's hungry, ain't she?" "She's been refusin' what I give her." His tone held defeat, the kind born of too many lonely nights. May hesitated, feeling a tremor in her chest that wasn't just sympathy. Maybe she needs a gentler hand. He watched as she dipped a rag in the warm milk and let the infant suckle. The baby quieted. Steam curled between them. When May glanced up, she found Elias studying her. Not the way men usually did, but as if trying to remember something long forgotten, like kindness. Outside, the wind moaned low across the roofs. Inside, the baby's small sighs were the only sound. He left soon after, murmuring his thanks. May stood by the window after he went, watching the shape of his shadow move across the snow until it vanished into darkness. Her heart beat strangely, slow and loud. She turned back to the fire, whispering to herself that it meant nothing. Yet all night she could still feel the warmth where the baby's tiny fingers had brushed hers. The next morning, talk traveled faster than the cold. By noon, Hattie Dunn's sharp tongue had already wrapped the story in poison. "May Collier got herself cozy with the sheriff's babe last night," she announced to whoever would listen. "Mark my words, women like that don't give kindness without wantin' something back." May heard it at the general store. Her face flushed deep as embers, but she said nothing. Words were wasted on people who'd already made up their minds. She carried her parcels home in silence, the snow squeaking beneath her boots. Days passed. The gossip clung to her like smoke. Still, when Elias returned a week later, baby Clara fussing in his arms, May forgot her shame for a moment. He looked thinner, worn. "She ain't keepin' nothin' down," he admitted. "I don't know what else to do." May hesitated only a breath before saying the words that would change everything. "Sir, if you'll allow it, I can nurse her. I've done it before. For another woman's child when I was cook down in Cheyenne." Elias blinked, torn between pride and desperation. Then he nodded slowly. "If you're sure." She took the baby gently, settling into the rocker near the fire. The world seemed to narrow to the rhythm of the child's breathing, the hush of snow pressing against the window panes. Elias sat across from her, hands clasped, eyes fixed on the flames. He said nothing, but the silence between them softened, as if something fragile had begun to thaw. Later, when Clara slept, May rose to pour more tea. Her movements were careful, deliberate, as though afraid to wake whatever peace had settled in the room. Elias reached for his hat, then paused. "Thank you," he said, voice rough. "You saved her some hurt." May smiled faintly. "Babies just need warmth, Sheriff. Same as the rest of us." He lingered a heartbeat longer than courtesy required, then left. That night, May dreamed of soft light and laughter that didn't sting. But dawn brought whispers again, this time crueler, louder. "She trapped him with that milk of hers," one woman hissed near the pump. "Ain't proper. Ain't decent." By afternoon, everyone seemed to know. Even Reverend Parnell looked away when May passed. Shame burned in her belly, hot as the coals she tended each night. She told herself to ignore them, but words, once spoken, have a way of echoing. When Elias next appeared at the inn, the air between them was brittle. He seemed distant, uneasy beneath invisible eyes. May understood before he spoke. "I reckon it's best I don't trouble you no more," he said. Her throat tightened. She wanted to ask why, but she already knew. The town had spoken, and he was still grieving. A man too careful to fight gossip when grief already made him small. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Of course, Sheriff. You owe me no explanation." He looked at her then, as though something in her composure shamed him, but said nothing more. When he turned and stepped out into the snow, the door closing behind him sounded like a verdict. The kitchen felt emptier after that. May worked without words, without song. Even the fire seemed reluctant to burn bright. Nights grew longer. The streets outside gleamed under moonlight like frozen glass, and she could hear laughter from the saloon drifting across the dark. Sharp, careless, human. Sometimes she pressed her hand against her chest, as if to quiet a heart that didn't know when to stop hoping. Other times, she would stand at the window and watch the faint glow from the sheriff's cabin up on the ridge. A single star against the dark. She told herself it didn't matter. Yet, in the stillness, she felt something inside her whisper back, "It does." One evening, a blizzard rolled in sudden and mean. The wind screamed through the valley, shaking doors and scattering shingles. The inn filled with travelers seeking shelter. May worked late, her body aching, her thoughts drifting to the ridge beyond town. She imagined Elias there, huddled by his fire with his baby, and wondered if he was warm enough. After the storm eased, she stepped outside for air. The world was silent again, the snow high as her knees, stars burning faint behind a veil of cloud. Somewhere in the distance a wolf cried, a low, mournful sound that echoed her own loneliness. She stood there until her fingers numbed, breathing frost. The inn behind her glowed gold against the endless white. Somewhere up the ridge, another light flickered faintly, a small pulse of life in the darkness. She drew her shawl tighter around her shoulders, unsure if the ache in her chest was sorrow or something far more dangerous, hope. Inside, the kettle began to whistle. May turned back, closing the door behind her. The latch clicked softly, like the heartbeat of the story itself, pausing, waiting, promising that winter was not yet done with them. The storm had not truly passed. It only slept, coiled above the mountains, whispering through the pine. Weeks slid by in brittle silence, and the gossip that once burned hot began to cool into something quieter, but no less cruel. May Collier stayed close to her kitchen, feeding strangers and keeping her eyes on her work. She told herself she no longer thought of Sheriff Boone. But when wind rose in the chimney and the snow turned the world to white again, she found her mind returning to his cabin. How his voice had sounded when softened by firelight. How the baby's tiny sighs had filled the spaces between their breaths. When Reverend Parnell appeared at the inn one gray morning, shaking snow from his hat, May sensed bad news before he spoke. "The baby's taken ill," he said, voice low. "Boone's been up for 2 nights straight. He won't ask for help, but the child's cough sounds mighty weak." May's hands tightened on the counter. "Clara?" she whispered. The Reverend nodded. "The good Lord gives us choice, Miss Collier. You do what your heart says is right." By the time night fell, the storm had gathered again, wind thrashing against the shutters. May wrapped herself in her shawl, packed bread and a jar of broth, and stepped into the snow. The cold hit her like a wall. Her breath came in small clouds, vanishing into darkness. The town slept behind her. Only the church bell above the ridge marked her passage, tolling faintly through the gale. Each step broke the crust of ice with a soft crunch. Her skirts dragged heavy. She didn't think of what people might say, only that a child was crying somewhere beyond the pines. The trail wound upward between drifts higher than fences. Once, she stumbled, catching herself on a fallen branch. Pain sliced across her palms, but she kept moving. The thought of Clara's tiny lungs struggling against fever drove her onward. When she reached the sheriff's cabin, her fingers were numb, and her hair rimed with frost. Light flickered inside, weak, wavering. She knocked once. The door opened to Elias Boone, hollow-eyed and exhausted. For a moment, disbelief crossed his face, then something like shame. May? His voice cracked. You shouldn't be out here. The Reverend told me, she said, stepping inside before he could argue. Where's the baby? He hesitated, torn between pride and gratitude. She's sleepin', if you can call it that. Fever's been high since yesterday. May set down her bundle, unwrapping the jar. Fetch some water, Sheriff. We'll bring her back to calm. He obeyed without protest. Together they worked in silence, moving through the small cabin like figures in a dream. She bathing Clara's forehead with cool cloths, he stoking the fire and pacing, restless and guilty. The snow hissed against the roof. Occasionally the wind moaned, as though the night itself pitied them. Hours passed. May sat in the rocker, humming low, the same lullaby she had sung weeks before. The child's breathing steadied, each exhale softer than the last. When at last, Clara slept peacefully, May's shoulders sagged with relief. Elias sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. I don't deserve your kindness, he said quietly. May looked up, the fire reflecting in her eyes. Deserve's got nothing to do with it. A child needed warmth. That's all I saw. He raised his head, studying her. The lines of weariness around his mouth softened. You came through half a blizzard for someone who turned his back on you. I came for her, May said, nodding toward the cradle. Then, almost as an afterthought, and maybe for you too. The words hung between them, fragile as frost. Outside, the wind began to die, leaving only the crackle of the fire. Elias leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I heard the things they said about you. I let them twist what was good into something shameful. His voice was low, almost a confession. I reckon that's a coward's sin. May shook her head slowly. It's a lonely man's one. Loneliness makes fools of all of us. He smiled then, a faint, weary curve of the lips that looked like the beginning of forgiveness. They sat together without speaking. The kind of silence that heals instead of hurts. Dawn came gradual and pale. Light slid across the floorboards, finding every rough edge and turning it gentle. May dozed in the chair, Clara curled against her chest. When she stirred, she found Elias watching her, not out of pity or apology, but with quiet awe, as though something precious had revealed itself in the long night. She'll be all right now, May murmured, brushing a thumb along the baby's cheek. I think we both will, he said. They moved carefully through the morning, their gestures unhurried. Elias brewed coffee. May kneaded dough she'd brought from home. The smell filled the small cabin, warm and alive. Every motion felt new, like remembering what life used to be before sorrow hollowed it out. By noon, the snow had begun to melt in small rivulets down the windows. Sunlight glinted off icicles like shards of glass catching flame. May stood by the door, preparing to leave. Town'll talk if I stay too long, she said softly. Elias walked her to the threshold. Let 'em talk. I've learned talk melts faster than snow come spring. She smiled, shy and uncertain. Still, I've work to do. The inn won't feed itself. He reached out, hesitated, then brushed a strand of hair from her face with rough fingers. Thank you, May, for comin', for stayin', for savin' her. Her heart trembled under the weight of all that went unsaid. She touched his hand lightly, just a whisper of contact, and stepped out into the thawing world. The days that followed carried the scent of change. The storm had broken the monotony of winter. The town, for all its gossip, began to soften in the wake of spring's first stirrings. When May returned to the inn, she found customers quieter, almost kind. Hattie Dunn avoided her eyes. Even Reverend Parnell offered a smile when he passed. Perhaps word had traveled that the baby lived because of her. Or perhaps people simply tired of cruelty once it stopped feeding them. One morning a knock sounded on the kitchen door. Elias stood there, hat in hand, a small bundle tucked under his arm. Clara, rosy and well, blinked up from the folds of her blanket. We thought we'd come by, he said. May's heart lifted like a bird startled into flight. She stepped aside, letting them in. The air between them felt different, steady, familiar. He placed the bundle on the table, pulled from his coat a folded piece of paper. I've been fixin' up the old stable behind the inn, he said. Figure it'd make a fine bakery if you're of a mind. Folks already say your bread smells like mercy. May blinked, stunned. You want me to stay? I reckon you already have, he replied, glancing toward the baby. She laughed then, quietly, the sound catching her by surprise. You're a strange man, Elias Boone. He smiled. Maybe, but I know a good thing when I see it now. That spring, Ash Hollow thawed in earnest. Snow melted into rivers, the mountains shed their white cloaks, and the first wildflowers pushed through the soil. May's Hearth, as Elias named it, opened its doors to the town. Every morning, the scent of fresh bread drifted down the main street. People came for loaves, for coffee, for warmth that no one had to earn. Some came out of guilt, some out of habit, but all left with quiet hearts. When gossip rose again, as gossip always does, it softened around the edges. The cook and the sheriff, they'd say, half smiling. Guess even winter gives way, sooner or later. Sometimes May would catch Elias watching her through the bakery window while she worked, his gaze steady, content. There were no grand declarations, no wedding bells, just small, certain gestures, the brush of hands when passing a tray, the shared nod when closing for the night, the sound of Clara's laughter echoing through the street. On the first warm evening of May, the three of them sat outside beneath the fading light. The sky stretched wide, painted in streaks of rose and gold. Elias held Clara on his knee while May poured coffee, her hands no longer trembling when she offered him a cup. He looked toward the horizon. World feels different when it starts to forgive itself, he said. May nodded. Maybe it never stopped. We just had to listen. The air smelled of pine and rising dough, of new beginnings baked into every breath. For the first time in years, May felt entirely seen, not as the woman too large for love, but as someone strong enough to keep a child alive, a hearth burning, and a man's heart from freezing over. Later, as dusk folded into night, she walked to the edge of town. The lights of Ash Hollow shimmered below like fireflies. She thought of the journey from shame to grace, from cold kitchens to warm hearths, and smiled to herself. The snow had melted, but its memory would stay, reminding her that every thaw begins with someone brave enough to walk into the storm. And if someone listening to her story ever doubted their worth, she would tell them this: kindness changes everything. It may not silence the world, but it softens its edges until there's room to breathe again. So if this tale found you in a lonely place, remember May Collier of Ash Hollow, the cook who crossed the snow for love that asked for nothing in return. Some fires, once lit, never die. And if her warmth reached you tonight, traveler, stay a while. There are more Wild West tales yet to be told. Subscribe, and let the next one find you before the embers fade.